Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jim Ryan, and I am the president of the University of Virginia, and I am delighted to be here for this important and timely conversation on democratic leadership in a populist age. I'd like to start by thanking former ambassador, statesman, diplomat, and current vice provost for global affairs at UVA, Steve Mull, who will moderate today's conversation. I'd also like to thank the co-sponsors of today's event, UVA Global, the Miller Center, the Karsh Institute of Democracy, and the Center for Asia-Pacific Resilience and Innovation, which is known as CAPRI. CAPRI got its start at UVA's Miller Center and is now the first international think tank in Taiwan. Today, I have the great honor to introduce former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and former Lord Mayor of the city of Sydney, Lucy Turnbull. Their accomplishments in service to their country are very relevant to the University of Virginia, a place that has, since its founding, a mission to serve our democracy. I also understand that this is the first visit to UVA in Charlottesville for both the Prime Minister and the Lord Mayor, and on behalf of our entire community, I'd like to say to both of you, welcome.
Thank you.
So Australia and the United States have much in common, and Australia holds a special place in the hearts of Americans, even though our countries sit quite far apart geographically. We share many things: a passion for personal freedom, an appreciation for the diversity of our societies, and a healthy obsession with sports and competition, just to name a few. I will say personally, Australia holds a special place in my own heart thanks to the game of rugby. As I was explaining earlier, 35 years ago, I traveled with a rugby team that was made up of players from New England colleges to go on a tour in New Zealand and Australia. And the idea, the coach was a British grad student from Harvard, and the idea was to demonstrate to those down under in New Zealand and Australia just how far American rugby had come. When we lost the first match 45-0, it was clear that the tour was going to be about how far we had to go, not how far we had come. Getting back to the topic at hand, Australia and the US also share some common challenges. We know that the principles of liberal democracy, which both of our countries treasure, face provocations from the forces of extremism, authoritarianism, violence, cynicism, and racism. And we both struggle to maintain public trust, to build resilience, and to improve our political institutions. For years, the Turnbulls have been passionate defenders of democratic values and have achieved great success in public leadership. They have embraced democratic ideals from intellectual freedom, the open exchange of ideas, and diversity in all its forms. While serving as Prime Minister of Australia and Lord Mayor of Sydney, they each promoted a vision of inclusiveness and justice for all. At the same time, they pushed for smart industrial and trade policies, environmental sustainability, and human rights. We have, as you'll hear, a lot to learn from the Turnbulls' leadership in Australia. As Prime Minister from 2015 to 2018, Malcolm helped to re-energize the Quadrilateral Security Forum with Japan, India, and United States. He saved the Trans-Pacific Partnership after abrupt US withdrawal and paved the way for legalization of same-sex marriage. His government also led the largest peacetime expansion and modernization of defense forces in Australian history. Lucy Turnbull served as the first female Lord Mayor of Sydney in the early 2000s, and in 2011 she was honored as an officer of the Order of Australia for her distinguished service to the community, local government, and business. Later, she served as the inaugural Chief Commissioner of the Greater Sydney Commission, and in this role delivered critical strategic planning for metropolitan Sydney. I very much look forward to the discussion and hearing their perspectives on the challenges and opportunities facing democracies around the world. And if today's discussion leaves you wanting more, you can always tune into Malcolm's podcast, Defending Democracy, where he regularly tackles many of the same issues we'll be hearing about today. So with that, I will turn it over to Steve Mull. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
Prime Minister and Lord Mayor Turnbull, Malcolm and Lucy, what a great honor it is for all of us here in the UVA community to host you. This is probably a fitting setting to begin our conversation by reference to the classics. About 2,400 years ago, Plato in the Republic, while saying that democracy was a great form of government, inevitably its demand for uncompromised freedom, distrust of elites, and so forth would inevitably lead towards to distrust in institutions, distrust in elites, a collapse in the polity that binds a society together, and inevitably lead to the rise of a strong man or a strong woman to set everything right. So our founder here, Thomas Jefferson, sharply disagreed with that. He thought the natural equilibrium of democracy over time would balance out this extremism and everything would be fine. But several of his colleagues among our founders disagreed. They were more inclined towards Plato. And so they built a constitutional republic that at the beginning had a lot of anti-democratic features to it, such as heavy restrictions on voting. Slavery was enshrined in our Constitution for 75 years. There was indirect election of our president, which continues, and of senators. And women, the restrictions on voting. Women were not allowed to vote until 1920. So for most of the past 250 years, most Americans have congratulated themselves that this has worked pretty well. But in recent years, a lot of people are beginning to wonder, maybe Plato was right. Maybe people don't trust these institutions anymore. Maybe it's not delivering the best possible experience to the people who live in democracies. What's your view from Australia? Each of you I'd be interested in hearing from. Are we in democracy's last days? Can it be saved? And if so, how?
Well, thank you very much, Steve. Lucy and I are really honoured to be here with you all today, particularly in this university founded by Thomas Jefferson. Let me say this, democracy, the key to liberal democracy is that it at once empowers the majority and constrains the majority. I mean, majoritarianism, which is really what Plato was talking about, could be the purest form of tyranny. And it is those constraints on the decisions of the majority, which of course your founding fathers were focused on structuring. And sometimes when people say that government is impossible and there are too many checks and balances, that's not a bug, that's a feature. And it's designed to stop, the rise of the tyrants. And so many tyrants, or big men, as you could describe them, have been popularly elected. But they're inclined to believe in one man, one vote once, and with the emphasis on the once. Now, you could say, and I've said this, that at the moment we could see liberal democracy, Western democracy, caught between the hammer of authoritarianism in the form of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, and the anvil of authoritarian populism, perhaps best seen here in the form of Donald Trump or more currently Rupert Murdoch and Fox News. And you can see, so how does liberal democracy survive that? I believe, and I say this after more than 50 years involved in politics and the media and the political media in one way or another, I think the greatest threat is within. The greatest enemies of our democracy, the greatest threats to our democracy are among us. And it is a consequence of dramatic changes in the way our democracies operate and the context in which they operate. Let me just talk a little bit about the media. There's often a mistake where people will talk about the media and politics as though they are two separate things. In fact, politics is and the media operate together. It was, apocryphally Winston Churchill, in fact it was someone else not nearly so well known, who said a politician who complains about the newspapers is like a sailor complaining about the sea. But it's a very good point, because that's the context in which we live. Now, if you go back 50 years, or even, frankly, a decade, or at least certainly 2 decades, the media had to reach a broad audience in order to maximise their, the eyeballs that they attracted. The Sydney Morning Herald, a very old newspaper when it was founded in 1840 or thereabouts, had on its front page some lines from Alexander Pope, in moderation placing all my glory, while Tories call me Whig and Whigs a Tory. Now, the old Fairfaxes who started that were not especially politically broad-minded, but they knew they needed to get a broad range of readers. Technology, the internet, cable television, the dramatic reduction in the cost of publishing and broadcasting has meant that you can monetize a narrowcast. Social media has meant that so much information that you receive no longer has to be curated. So if you've got on the one hand the ability to have curated media, like a cable news channel, that can target a very relatively narrow audience, and of course on social media you can target what numerically is a tiny audience, but might be strategically terribly important. And so part of the difficulty there is that we find increasingly we're not sharing the same facts, we're not actually in the same room. We're all in the same room today. And arguably you could say in the previous media dispensation, all of us were in the same room nationally. Nowadays that's not the case. And the problem with that is that you get the degree of division and animosity and a culture in the political media which you can only really describe as angertainment. So I was very pleased to see the judgment or the settlement in the Dominion voting case yesterday. I mean, that's a very big number. All of us, many of us would have preferred to see the witnesses in the box being cross-examined. But nonetheless, that was a case where one of the major architects of this division was held to account. I mean, it is an extraordinary thing, an extraordinary threat to your country and by extension to the rest of the world, because it proved it was possible that so many Americans could be persuaded of what was self-evidently and demonstrably a lie. Now, your country was founded on an armed insurrection against illegitimate government. When that's your foundation story. Thomas Jefferson was part of it. So if you have people who know they are lying, using the biggest megaphone in the country to say that the government was stolen and the president, the man who's been appointed president by the constitutional processes, is in fact a fraud, that is, I would say, the most dangerously consequential lie told in this country in the lifetimes of all of us. So the real challenge is, how do we restore the equilibrium in politics? Now, I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts, because I know this is a discussion, not a speech. And I often say, when I start to speak, I'll be brief, but then add to that, there is no circumstance in which a politician or former politician will more reliably mislead you than when he says, I'll be brief. So I have to strain with that. I've often been criticised for this, being wordy. Let me make a couple of observations. It was Steve Bannon who said, and excuse the vulgarity, he said that one of his tactics was to flood the zone with shit. And what he meant was, pump out as much misleading information as you possibly could, because what that does is confuse people, it makes them trust nothing, and they lose their mooring on what is accurate and what is not, and they then become untethered, and of course are more likely to believe anything. What is the answer to that? Well, if you go back a decade, you would have said, when crazy things are uttered in a political context, ignore them. As we would say in the cricketing country, let them go through to the keeper, because if you strike out at them, you'll just give them more salience. That doesn't apply anymore. In the viral media age we live in, you've got to have a whack-a-mole approach. So you've actually got to flood the zone with facts. This is what Theresa May, the former British PM, said on one of the episodes of my podcast the other day, and it's a really good point. She said the answer is to flood the zone with facts. So you've got to be as aggressive in getting the facts out there as you can. The problem is lies tend to get more traction. Point Maria Ressa, the Nobel Prize winning heroic journalist in the Philippines has often observed. The second thing is institutions matter. We are really fortunate in Australia to have some elements in our electoral system which we've had for over 100 years, actually. So there's no one alive can take any credit for it. We have compulsory voting. So everybody, once you turn 18, you have to be on the electoral roll. And the Electoral Commission, which is a national body, which is non-political, draws the boundaries, so no gerrymanders, they will put you on the electoral roll. And you have to vote. You get fined $20 if you don't vote. So our turnout in elections is well over 90%. And even when you've got a voluntary vote, which we rarely do, such as the plebiscite I held to determine whether we would legalise same-sex marriage, even that completely voluntary vote got 80% turnout. And I might say 62% voted yes. So it was done. We also have preferential voting, which you call ranked choice voting. And what this means is that you get your politics is drawn to the centre. You don't have to run off to the extremes to get your vote out, to mobilise your, quote, base, unquote. And so you get politics happening more at the centre. And so while we share, regrettably, the sort of Murdoch right-wing media entertainment system in Australia, and believe me, we know exactly how they operate, our electoral system gives us greater resilience. So, institutions, structures, voting systems, they may seem a bit prosaic, but they really make a difference. Of course, it's something that your founding fathers understood too, in the care with which they designed the Constitution. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy.
Well, I think he's covered the field on national politics. So what I'd like to talk about is actually architecture and this building. This is an exquisite building in an extremely beautiful campus, and that lawn is just one of the most beautiful university spaces I've ever seen in my life. And I think about the principles around which it was designed, which were configured, as we know, by Thomas Jefferson, the founder of the university. It's actually quite interesting. There's a drawing on the room we're staying in, one of those houses down there, that depicts the Chateau de Mull, just outside of Paris, near the Royal Park it was, and was demolished in 1806. But the Chateau de Mull was actually used by the king as a less formal way of interacting with his courtiers and with society. So it was actually a transition from the Chateau of Versailles, which we've probably all visited as tourists, into if you like, a more, user-friendly space that he could be less formal in. And, and it is. I mean, it is one of the most exquisite places for scholarship and learning. And of course, he is one of the fathers of democracy as it was conceived in the Declaration of Independence and as it has evolved. And I think we have to remember that democracy in your country has evolved, as has ours, for example, with enfranchising everybody, with abolishing slavery, with giving everybody the right to vote, which is a big step forward in democracy, which didn't exist when our nation's constitutions were created. So I think to that end, we have to appreciate that our democracies must keep evolving. And in a constrained era where you do get a lot of capacity to misinform, where, of course, social media platforms are very notable for achieving that outcome, but also, social media platforms can also disseminate truth. And so I agree with Theresa May, you have to actually flood the zone with truth, as well as the misinformation that naturally tends to inhabit it. And I think my own experience is much more in metropolitan government, working closely with the state government in New South Wales and in local government. And I think that, so my community engagement, if you like, has been much more grassroots and much more local. And that's actually a very salient thing to do, to talk to people about whether they like the proposal for a new development, or whether they want to put a school here or a hospital there, or what does the community want. And one of the most, I guess, democratic things I've ever done is to lead an engagement process across the whole of metropolitan Sydney, which actually had never been done before in the way it had been done. And we spoke to tens and tens of thousands of people, lots of industry organisations, etc., and actually put together a plan which gave a new vision for Sydney, which is a very large metro area. It's about 4.8 million people, but we reconceptualised it as not just having a city centre, but having three distinct centres: the eastern harbour city, the central river city, and the western parkland city. So actually reconceptualising a plan which was immediately adopted by people that I used to buy the newspaper from, and, you know, sodas at the train station when I went to work. They said, "Oh, Lucy, we love you. You are giving full credit to Parramatta," which had never been credited. So when you engage with people, when you actually go to the grassroots and talk to people about what interests them, you can actually capture their imagination. So it's the job of all leaders to actually engage people on the terms that they want to be engaged with, to listen to people and to listen to what they have to say, but also talk about what they want to know about, and not just do it from 60,000 feet.
Oh, thanks. Malcolm, you earlier described former President Trump as one of the anvils against the hammers of Xi and Putin. And I remember from my time in government, you were actually one of the first allied leaders that President Trump engaged with soon after taking office. Can you share what was that like? Americans like to think of their president as the leader of the free world, and here was your first encounter with the leader of the new leader of the free world. What did you think about future prospects for American leadership of that free world and democracy in general?
Well, look, the American democracy has and will survive Donald Trump. So, although I was supposed to say Barack Obama genuinely feared that it wouldn't survive 2 terms of Trump. That was his considered view. I wouldn't express an opinion on that, but it was a colourful discussion. And of course, the transcript was briefed out later by the White House, by, we believe, Mr. Bannon, in fact, to demonstrate how angry Trump was. And yes, he was furious with me. But the story was pretty simple. We had reached an agreement with the Obama administration whereby some people who had sought to come to Australia with people smugglers who had been detained in 2 places, in PNG and on Nauru, actually by a previous government as it happens, but that's a footnote. They'd been detained. We didn't want to bring them to Australia because that would get the people smugglers going again. I mean, this is a long-standing issue in Australia. And I talked to Obama about it, and we felt that if he would agree to them being considered for resettlement in the United States, we could offer to resettle in Australia people that were unable to be resettled in the US. And so we did reach a deal on it. It was worked for both countries. Trump was elected, and obviously he had a very tough policy on immigration, but we were led to believe that he would honour the deal. So that is an exception. Anyway, about an hour before I had this call, Mike Pence rang our Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, and General Flynn rang my National Security Advisor, and they both had the same message, which was, the President's not going to honour the deal's off, Prime Minister shouldn't raise it. Well, naturally I did raise it. And so we had this sort of increasingly ferocious call in which he got, I was not angry. I mean, I'm smart enough not to pick fights with the President of the United States, but he was certainly letting me know how he felt. And it sort of famously ended up with saying, you know, I've had a lot of calls this day. This is the worst one I've had. This is even worse than Putin. Now, Lucy later observed, after the transcript had been published, that, of course, given that he was so fond of Putin, that really, that wasn't such a big hit. But it was difficult, but he did stick. Look, to give Trump credit, he stuck to the deal. I mean, the conversation began, no way, Jose, and ended up, yes, but I hate you, sort of like. But we ended up getting on very well, to be honest. I actually had another engagement with him over tariffs, where he listened. We persuaded him not to impose tariffs on Australian steel. And I persuaded him that it was actually not in his interest to do so. I've set out a lot of that in my memoir, which, you know, really for the use of future leaders. But, you know, he was not immune to rational argument. But obviously he was very, you know, from a foreign policy point of view, and you know this as an ambassador, I mean, the erratic nature of Trump's leadership and the fact that he sort of rattled friend and foe alike, and, you know, would appear to snuggle up to dictators and threaten to break long-standing alliances like NATO, for example, just to pick one at random. All of this was incredibly unsettling. But, you know, the good thing about the relationship between Australia and the US is that it is based in, you know, it's based in the hearts of, frankly, millions of Australians and Americans. You could have a prime minister and a president who hated each other and actually were really rude to each other. It honestly wouldn't, I mean, it would be unhelpful. And diplomats like yourself would, you know, scratch their heads and say, how are we going to clean up this mess? But the relationship is so strong and it's so deep. I think it's, you know, it's got such an important foundation. But equally, you can't take it for granted. It's like democracy. You know, it's what Ben Franklin said, you know, when, you know, after the convention, and the passerby said, you know, what is it? And he said, well, it's a republic if you can keep it. That's it. You know, we've got to work to hang on to it. Democracy is very fragile, and friendships have to be tended and nourished and supported, just like a garden. And so even a strong friendship, like between Australia and the United States, it's important to work on it. But one cranky president or one cranky prime minister is not going to blow it up.
Well, that's a relief. Lucy,
even if they try.
Okay. Lucy, I wonder if I could ask you about your experience in the government of Sydney, which from this side of the globe seems like such an amazing place to live. More than 5 million people, about 40% of the people who live there were born outside of Australia, a remarkably diverse and harmonious and progressive place. How did you manage to govern a city so diverse with so many possible and potential tensions so well?
Well, listen, every city has its tensions, but Sydney is, you know, it's a very big city. It's the biggest Australian city. Melbourne's catching up because they're you know, it's a topography thing. So Melbourne's topography is very flat, so they can keep on doing residential single dwelling subdivisions till they get to South Australia, basically, if they want to keep going. But and we are constrained by our topography. We call ourselves a parkland city because we have the Blue Mountains on one side and rivers on the other, and the Tasman Sea, which we often misname the Pacific Ocean, on the other side. So we're kind of constrained in the Sydney Basin, which makes the topography and the landscape and the place so beautiful. And what I think, it's a big spread out city, you know, compared to, say, a city like London. It's got about the same surface area as London, but it's got a much smaller population. And so what we've got to do is to keep working with the fabric that we have, and to make sure that we coordinate not just land use, but, you know, it's the golden goal. It's a sort of like, it's the gold at the bottom of the rainbow is actually, with any large city, and I've spoken to mayors and former mayors of London, New York, lots of other cities, it's actually pulling together the transport and the land use planning with the infrastructure, not just the grey infrastructure like the roads and the bridges, but the green infrastructure, the open spaces, and the social infrastructure like the hospitals and the schools and the colleges, etc. So it's bringing together a whole mosaic of things which create a place which is kind of, has always fascinated me and still does. And you can only do it with the best of good faith and really good negotiating partners, and you have to get everybody that can deliver this outcome around the table And that can only be a productive conversation if there's mutual respect and trust and regard and, I think, understanding of what each other's role is. I mean, you know, I'm sure it's the same in the US. Often the transportation department only wants to build bridges and roads, and to get them to think about doing things in another way can be interesting. And, you know, the same for anything, the same for education, the same for whatever. One of the things with education is actually quite interesting, because schools always want to close their gates, their fences and their gates after school. And in built-up areas, often school yards or school grounds can be one of the best open spaces for kids to play after school and on weekends, etc. So how do you get a kind of like a mindset for the education department whose least risky choice is to lock the school up after hours, yet that deprives kids of open space? And that can only happen if you engage with people and find a way of doing it. So it's not quite the same as doing the TPP, but it's on a local level, it's quite similar. So I love sort of doing small things that make a difference to people's lives.
Can I give Lucy credit for a very big
Please.
thing? This is be very familiar to Americans. You've got federal government, state government, local government. And generally they're seeking to do the same things, good things by and large, but they're very often uncoordinated and operating like ships in the night, you know, because they're run by different people. Lucy, when I was PM, we had a big change to the way this operated, and this was very much Lucy's idea. And we established something called city deals, that the name we actually stole from the UK, but that they don't have a federal system like we do. And so what we did was we took areas of cities and parts of cities like Western Sydney or, you know, various regions. And we got the federal government, state government, local government, and in some cases other big stakeholders, got them round a table and said, okay, what do we all want to achieve here? What do we want? And you actually sat down and agreed on what you wanted to do. And then said, all right, we've agreed on what we're going to do. Who's going to do what and who's going to pay for it? And then lock people in. So yes, we're going to build a railway line from here to here. The feds will pay half of it, the state will pay half of it. You know, local government will provide this. And those city deals made such a difference, because you've still got disputes and stuff, but to actually get people locked in and agreeing on an agenda. And then, of course, it is audited every year and there's a report, you know, they've complied with this or not complied with that. And it is because, you know, the wonderful diversity we have in complex countries, particularly federations, is admirable in many respects, but a little bit of coordination can help too. So that was really a very important reform in planning, and it was really Lucy's vision.
Can I just say, in a similar vein, thank you very much, Malcolm, for that compliment, but in a similar vein, what I did was I worked with lots of state agencies like police, you know, city councils, you know, liquor industry, you know, people who had hotels and stuff, to develop an idea of a women's safety charter, because very keen on female participation in the workforce, but also in civil life, and, you know, feel like it's safe for them to go out at night alone and walk the streets alone. So if you have a kind of like a focus on what makes a place feel safe or you know, is actually be safe and feel safe, which often are the same things, for women, it actually organises people's thinking around an idea. But it's not exclusionary, because if a place feels safe for women, it also feels safe for children. It also feels safe for minorities. So it's, you know, looking at how a city works and functions through a particular lens, which looks like it might be exclusionary, but it's actually the opposite.
Great. Malcolm, you'd earlier mentioned the big legal news here this week of the settlement between Dominion Voting Systems and, can we call him your compatriot, Rupert Murdoch?
Well, Rupert actually renounced his Australian citizenship, so he's all yours. He is generally regarded as an Australian, but and the reason for that was would have been back in the 80s, in the days when you couldn't have dual citizenship. He wanted to buy some American broadcast licenses and he had to have US citizenship, so he had to renounce his Australian citizenship. But I'm
Lucky
sure he
us.
could
Lucky
get it back.
us.
Lucky, yeah. I'm sure he could get it back. I'm sure.
Well, and I understand that you've thrown your support behind a call for a royal commission of inquiry into him. And you know, whenever in a democracy you start talking about how do we best control the press, people start to get a little bit uncomfortable, and rightfully so. But at the same time, it's undeniable that the modern media system, or parts of it anyway, are doing a lot to make modern democracies ungovernable. So how do you square that paradox to make sure that you're not controlling the press while ensuring they're not destroying democracy?
Yeah, well, I think we've got to the problem that when you saw this is the example with Dominion voting systems is very clear. And I mean, this is not, what I'm saying is not contentious. I mean, this is what came out in, you know, the Murdoch's père et fils and the commentators, you know, own discovery, you know, their own emails and correspondence. So they had a situation where Trump was saying the election was stolen, which was not true. All the senior people at Fox knew it was untrue and believed it was they believed it was crazy. But their audience wanted to believe it. And they were concerned that they were losing viewers to other right-wing media outlets because they had called the election for Biden in Arizona, a call that turned out it was correct. And so they elected to instead tell lies and amplify lies, including, you know, the conspiracy theory that the Dominion voting machines were, you know, secretly sort of masterminded by Hugo Chavez. I think Hugo Chavez was dead by this stage.
Yeah.
From beyond the grave.
Details. This is don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. Anyway, and so they decided to do that, and of course, this helped create the environment that made January 6 possible. I mean, January 6 would not have happened. I'm not suggesting the Murdochs, you know, were telling people to storm the Capitol, but it could not have happened had not millions of people believed the election had been stolen. And so, you know, I mean, in a sense, we're lucky that this case actually held them to account. You know, the whole theory of, you know, the First Amendment and free speech, you know, which does have some limitations even in America, is that in the marketplace of ideas, truth will prevail. And yet the problem is we're drowning in lies. And so there is a real challenge. And that's why I think what Teresa said is absolutely right. You've got to fight back. You've got to challenge this stuff. And you can't just say, oh, well, you know, everyone's entitled to their opinion. But they may be entitled to their opinion, but as, you know, Moynihan said, they're not entitled to their own facts. And that's basically the problem that we've got into. And you get these silos where people are essentially being indoctrinated and radicalized. Now, you know, I think the sort of more centre-left, smaller liberal media is much more fact-based, is what I would say. I led a centre-right party, by the way. It's called the Liberal Party, but its closest international analogue would be the British Conservative Party. So I'm not speaking, you know, from this as a big lefty by any means, but I think we have to push back on this, and we've got. I think if we don't, we're going to get into a situation where the creation of false narratives and what I've called dangerously consequential narratives are going to put democracy at risk.
Can I give you another example of that? Not just what's been happening in the States, but I think, and I know there's at least one British person in the room, but the information or lack thereof before the Brexit vote, to me, sort of sitting in Australia was quite remarkable.
It was mind-blowing, wasn't it?
Was actually mind-blowing, because there wasn't a sort of like an economic white paper or pink paper, whatever colour papers are in the UK, you know, economic analysis of the risks and the downsides of Brexit. There was no kind of salient, well-compiled, you know, well-informed objective information available. So it created a very fertile environment for a lot of misinformation to have been spread, and people in the UK are living with the consequences, and I think they never imagined these consequences because they were never pointed out in a salient way.
Yeah, well, the Brexit referendum, you know, which is an incredibly consequential thing. I mean, the UK, just, you know, for everyone's information, has the lowest economic growth of any developed country at the moment. I mean, Russia has a higher level of economic growth, GDP growth, than the UK at the moment. I mean, they're in diabolical straits. And of course, at a time of rising protectionism, stepping out of the largest free trade zone in the world will do that for you. You know, it's not a smart thing to do. But Lucy's right, it was essentially uninformed consent. And I mean, and this is where institutions like the Miller Centre and indeed CAPRI, which Shirley Lynn established with the Miller Centre, are so important. I mean, you know, you need honest brokers, whether they are universities or think tanks, actually getting the facts out there, because very often you can't rely on, you know, the mainstream media, let alone social media, to do that. I mean, in our region, you know, in sort of East Asia, Southeast Asia, depending how you define it, there's not much of a think tank tradition, and this is where CAPRI's been so important. I mean, I know it sounds like a very attractive island off the coast of Italy, but it's actually making a real difference, particularly in the areas of health resilience. But of course, all of these things are linked, whether it's health resilience, environmental resilience, political resilience. You know, we've got to be in a position where we can withstand those shocks. And, you know, that's where you get back to what I was saying earlier about electoral systems. You know, you've got to look at your outcomes and ask yourself, how did we get here? Now, if you believe, for as many Americans do, I know, that the political disposition of a large percentage of the Congress are much more extreme than the electorate at large, then you've got to ask yourself, this is meant to be a representative body. So if your electoral system is tending to push people to the edge, candidates to the edge, that's actually quite you know, counterproductive. You actually want to bring people to the centre, because the more debate operates at the centre, the more people are going to be inclined to do what they're meant to do in parliaments and congresses, which is, you know, wheel and deal and compromise and, you know, reach agreement. And also, they're more likely to accept changes in government. You know, if you get your political narratives moving too far apart, people are not going to accept a change of government or a change of leadership. The closer they are, the more incremental political changes, the more readily it can be absorbed and accepted, and that's very important if you want to maintain a peaceful polity.
I wanted to ask about what are the secrets of success in democracy. It seems like some of the ingredients are a shared sense of national purpose, national identity, shared values among the entire society. And Lucy, as I was hearing you discuss your experience in local government, it seems it's probably marginally easier to do at the local level. People's kids go to school together, they go to the parks together, they live next door to each other. It seems like it might be easier to establish that sense of common purpose. How is it possible to do that at a national level, when we're looking at the narrow casting that you talked about, which is just driving a sense of fragmentation and bitterness that makes it really hard to develop that sense of common purpose and identity. Did you, Malcolm, learn anything as Prime Minister on a national level about what worked in trying to create that sense?
Well, I think it's important to treat your, see, that depends what you're seeking to do. I mean, if your goal as a political leader is to use anger and resentment as a means of achieving power, then you may be successful politically in the sense of winning an election, but you'll do so at an enormous national cost. Now, I could never do that, right? Pretty much every time I used to get up and speak, I would talk about the diversity of Australia, how our diversity is our greatest strength, which one of our greatest strengths you can't, we don't define our national identity by reference to, ethnicity, religion, race, or anything like that. It's a commitment to shared political values. Americans would say the same. That is, that's so critical. Now, you've got to be prepared to call out those that are seeking to divide your society. I mean, it is because regrettably, it works. This is one of the fundamental problems, that the bad actors, the people that seek to divide your society, can often be politically successful. So, that's...
Not always. I would say not always. I would say, using Australian examples, which you don't know, but say in the state of Victoria, that the politics of division and excoriation of the state government actually was very mobilised by Mr Murdoch's assets in Victoria, and it absolutely didn't work. I think there is an immunity setting in Australia anyway, and I hope it's setting in the US as well. There is an immunity and a greater understanding, and perhaps this legal settlement yesterday will solidify that trend, because I think people know that the truth isn't always, what it is shouted from the hilltops from the noisiest person as being said as the truth is not actually the truth. So if there's you don't actually want to teach a population to be sceptical, but I think there is a greater scepticism now, or there certainly should be, and there is in Australia. There have been scare campaigns which simply haven't worked. And we just need to inoculate. It's really a question of immunisation and inoculation, not in a controversial way. I'm not suggesting there should be mass immunisation. Let's not get into that conversation, vaccination. But the only way you can do that is by saying, listen, these mistakes were made at this time because this wasn't done properly and there wasn't enough information out there. Let's get it out there.
I think I agree with that, Lucy. Interesting point. And this is where compulsory voting really helps. I mean, look, I know every American I know tells me that it'd be a bridge too far, but it does, if you get a high turnout, it makes such a difference. And the other thing is, if you have...
I think ranked choice voting is more like
ranked choice voting, ranked choice vote. It's interesting, you guys have it in a number of jurisdictions, particularly in Alaska and Maine in particular. And I'll give you an example of how it operated. So my party, the Liberal Party, after I was sort of, deposed, I guess, as Prime Minister in 2018, the party moved very much to the right. And that, and Rupert was quite involved, actually personally quite involved in this, but it's a long story. Moved to the right, and a lot of traditional larger Liberal voters, which you might call in this context, large R Republican voters, started to feel uncomfortable, But what do? Do you in your country, because you've first past the post voting, your options are to, you've got four options. I mean, Adam Kinzinger made this point to me the other day in a podcast. It was interesting. You can hold your nose and still vote Republican if you think it's gone, you don't agree with the MAGA stuff. You can hold your nose perhaps even tighter and vote for your lifelong political foes, the Democrats. You can stay at home, an option you don't have in Australia. Or, as Adam pointed out, you can self-radicalise. And you can persuade yourself that, in fact, all this crazy stuff is actually sensible. Now, in Australia, with ranked choice voting, this is a good example of what happened. This happened in a whole series of hitherto really safe centre-right electorates. The larger Liberal incumbent, so the centre-right incumbent, would typically get first preference votes of 50% or more, say 55%. So they've won on first preferences. With small L Liberal women who were strong on climate, strong on gender equality, strong on public integrity, ran as independents, seeking the centre ground. What happened was, the typical case was the incumbent's vote, primary vote, went from 50 plus to 40. The independence vote came in at 30, so that's 70. The remaining 30% of the primary votes cast, say to the Labor Party, the Centre-Left Party or the Greens or whatever, then of course their preferences were distributed. They went to the independent. So when the preferences are distributed, the independent typically won on a two-party preferred basis 55-45. Now, Liz Cheney's here at the university speaking, and I remember talking to Liz about this in Washington, but when she was still in the Congress. If you'd had that in Wyoming, she would have won, for sure, absolutely, because there would have been Republicans that would have voted for her, even if the MAGA-endorsed Republican had come first. She would have certainly come second, and she would then have won on Democrat preferences. So and this is why I think Alaska and Maine have more moderate Republican representatives than other states do. And it's because as Lucy says, compulsory voting, preferential voting pulls people to the centre, and also not having gerrymanders is important. But I mean, you all understand that better than anyone. I mean, it's really important. I mean, drawing districts is always contentious, but when you actually draw them to fix them so that one party's got no hope of winning, it's really counterproductive. Ideally, the more electorates that are contestable, the better in a democracy.
Indeed. Well, I'd like to open the floor to take questions from our audience. We have a couple of colleagues in the back with microphones. Any questions? Yes, over here. Margot? No, the mic is coming to you, Margot.
Hi, I'm Margot Smith. I'm director of Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection, and I'm going to see you tomorrow morning over at the museum. Yeah. But as you know, one of UVA's strong relationships with Australia is we have the only museum of Indigenous Australian art outside Australia. So there's a referendum coming up in Australia, and it's the Voice to Parliament. I don't think a lot of people in the room really know about it, but I'd be curious if you would explain just briefly what it means and what your thoughts are about it.
Okay, well, very briefly, the proposal is that to insert in the Constitution a provision which would say there shall be a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament, at which will have the right to advise the Parliament and the executive government. And that this voice would be effectively an assembly or a committee, however you want, or council, and this will be chosen, the manner of its structure, composition, method of choice will be determined by Parliament. This proposal's been going around a long time. It is Lucy and I both voting for it. I was not supportive of it, frankly, when it was first proposed in 2017, not because I had any objections to the idea to the concept. My objection was because I am very much a small R Republican, which is why, as you know, I did my best to remove the British monarchy from our constitution as well. But I struggled with the idea that we'd have any office or position in our constitution for which the qualification was anything other than Australian citizenship. But the reality is this has enormous support from Indigenous people, and I think we owe it to them, who've had a very raw deal, to say the least, to support it. So it would be a contradiction for me of my Republican principles, but we're certainly supporting it. How will it go?
I'm very in support of it, and I was supporting it from the get-go. Malcolm initially was very sceptical. I think some of the tricky things will happen with the legislation. For example, in one of the reports, which was written by Marcia Langton and Tom Calmer, they have basically a federal kind of Senate model for who is to represent, how many representatives there are in this voice council. And I'm a bit concerned that would oversimplify things and institutionalise the worst bits of our federal system, like, where you have two senators from each state, and we have, to have fixed numbers per state. I think we need to concentrate
regardless of
representation.
size.
Yeah, regardless of size. We need to have the representation greater where there are more Aboriginal people, and especially Aboriginal people who are particularly disadvantaged. Because, if you like, the delta between the economic and socio-economic position of Aboriginal people living in cities is not nearly as great as if they live in regional and very isolated communities. And they're the people who are really voiceless now, and they need to be given a voice.
Yeah, so the bottom line is, will it succeed? Australian referendums are very hard to win. So to change our constitution, you need a national vote and you need a majority in 4 out of the 6 states. It's very hard. We've had 42 proposals, I think, and only 6 or so have been successful, including the Republic referendum was defeated, as you probably know. The compulsory voting, which I've extolled, actually from constitutional change point of view is really unhelpful, because if you drag everyone to the polls and say you've got to vote, if you don't understand a proposition, if you haven't got your head around it, you haven't read about it, may not, that might be because you're, not very smart, or it might just be you're very busy and you haven't had time to look into it. But for whatever reason, if you don't know, you're much more likely to vote no. So I think this has got a really good chance of success. So we hope it does.
But again, the opposition party is stoking the fires of division. To this point, it doesn't really seem to be working, and I hope it doesn't work, because if we wake up the day after the referendum vote and it is not carried, it will be collectively one of the saddest days in Australia's life, I think.
I think it's yes. Anyway, there it is, but it's happening, and this is all part of this is one of the things that was not even recognised in our constitution was the fact that Australia's history did not begin in 1788 when the white settlers arrived, right? So there was 60,000 years of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander civilization, occupation of our country, and it is the oldest continuous human civilization, on Earth, frankly. So it's pretty remarkable. And talk about resilience, the fact that they're still there. I mean, there's an Aboriginal community in Sydney, right? This is not remote. Might be remote from Charlottesville. It's not remote, but in Sydney, on the shores of Botany Bay, there are Aboriginal families living there whose ancestors were also living there when the British settlers arrived in 1788. In fact, when Captain Cook, poked his nose in 1770. So it's shown great resilience,
And about 40,000 years before that.
Yeah, that's right. So it is anyway. So yes, it's a good chance. If you have dual citizenship, I don't know whether you do or not, but I see you could. Yeah. Well, no, you go. Sure. But anyway, please vote yes.
But don't leave us, Margot.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Is it on? Yeah. Very good to have you in Virginia today. My name is Patrick Wilson. My question is about, you had a certain specific amount of scorn for the broadcast media. We talked a lot today about the Rupert Murdoch and Fox. Yeah. But it seems that democracy has other challenges, right, which are technology-based, and they don't all come from the center-right or even the right. People, because of algorithms and technology, can be told exactly what they want to hear, right? So that's not a problem or a function of the right. Wherever you set politically, there's an algorithm that will create a news cycle just for you, so you never turn away, because you never have to encounter views that are different than your own. Isn't that itself really the challenge, and not that one broadcaster might be tweaking their news broadcast to please voters so that they don't change the channel? But really, all of us are in that situation, right? Where we all are in a tended garden made for by these algorithms of the news, and that affects democracy.
Oh, look, I think I think that's absolutely a very powerful point. But I think currently the threats to democracy are mostly coming from the right. That's my honest belief at the moment. I mean, I think it's I'm not to say that there isn't,
Certainly in Australia.
Yeah, certainly in Australia. And I would, as a friendly observer of your country, I would say, from here, I think that is more of that's a stronger threat. Not suggesting there aren't threats elsewhere. The algorithms you talk about are really this is part of the problem. Is if the goal is to keep your eyeballs on a particular platform, whether it is Facebook, Twitter, whatever, YouTube, or indeed broadcast news, the tendency is to feed information and news and material that will rile you up. This is why I call it angertainment. And the difficulty with that, that means that you create a society which is angrier and more divided. And this is where we've actually got to say, Houston, there's a problem, because if our societies are angrier and more divided, that is really bad, because we all know division is death in politics.
Can I just make another observation? I think you're absolutely right, and in the sense that algorithms, taking the political spectrum out of it, algorithms do give you what you want to read, and like if you speak to a newspaper editor, everybody, most people read their newspapers in a digital format, and so they could get instant, contemporaneous feedback of which articles are being read and which ones aren't being read. And so that if something is being read or watched, they'll just, by an overwhelming number of readers or subscribers, they will keep doing it. So it's that instant contemporaneous feedback which is kind of systemic and embedded, and you can't really strip that away, because that would be an extraordinary constraint on the way business operates, because other businesses do it too, like people who are selling Amazon books or whatever it is. Everybody does it. Everybody's getting as much data as they can. But this is where the truth and the veracity comes into it. You have to say, this is happening. There's no doubt that this is happening. We've got algorithms. Let's just make sure they're as accurate as we could possibly make them. And let's give people a duty, a social and a positive legal duty, not to misrepresent the truth.
Yeah, look, it gets back to this question of the silos. When people used to turn on CBS News in the days of Walter Cronkite, but Democrats and Republicans watched that, and they came often to different conclusions, but they were basically getting the straight up news. That's the world that is increasingly at risk. Now we're lucky in Australia to have something, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the ABC, which is, I guess, like the BBC or CBC in Canada. And they get criticised all the time. I used to be a television journalist, literally nearly 50 years ago. But so I'm sort of unfamiliar with the field, but nonetheless, they're much more, they've got a legal statutory obligation to be accurate in their news reporting and balanced and in their commentary. So that helps. It's it's a challenge. We've got to ask ourselves, are we happy about the degree of division that we've got at the moment? And if the answer to that is no, we're not happy, then we've got to ask ourselves whether there are things that are going wrong in our media landscape that can be addressed. And, telling the truth always helps.
I think we have time for just a couple more questions. This young lady here, and maybe if you could ask your question, and then the gentleman in the blue jacket, if you could ask your question, and then you can answer them together.
Okay.
Hi, Hi, my name's Emily. I'm a fourth year computer science and politics major here at the University of Virginia. And so in the United States, we've kind of seen this trend of kind of the downfall of local journalism and kind of the consolidation of the media market. And as I understand, the media market in Australia is also pretty concentrated. So I was wondering what your guys' thoughts are on the importance of local journalism as a defense against kind of malicious actors in our democracy. Thank you.
I think it's very much, I'll answer briefly. You're right, it's very much under threat in Australia as it is in the US. It's actually a big risk to our democracy, certainly in the way state and state government issues are covered and city and regional issues are covered. It is a major issue. There have been in Australia sort of startup companies trying to do the job that traditional mainstream media companies who closed down their operations have been doing. It is a real struggle to get advertising, for these small media startup, these local newspapers, and it is an unresolved but very pressing problem.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think one of the problems you've got with national media markets is that all of the focus is on the national news, and there's less and less scrutiny on local matters, whether it's local municipal matters, local state matters, and that's really bad for democracy. So that sort of drought, that news drought outside of Washington in your country or Canberra in our country is a big issue. When I first worked in journalism, I was in the press gallery of the New South Wales Parliament, that was a big press gallery. And with a lot of serious coverage. Not so it's a shadow of its former self today. Having said that, if you get into other state capitals in Australia, there's virtually nothing, very, very little. You get into Lucy is the Lord Mayor of Sydney. There's actually in the City Council chambers, there is a press gallery. I mean, empty, right? Because so getting that local coverage is important, and I think it's one of the things that if there is money to be distributed to support democracy, getting it into local news local news coverage I think is very valuable, because ultimately all politics is local, right? I mean, there are national races clearly, but in terms of getting someone elected to Congress, the critical issue is getting that local vote out, and often the local media can be important.
2 years ago, there was an interesting thing that the previous government, led by Scott Morrison, did, which was to do a deal with, on the one hand, Facebook and Google and other similar companies, and the mainstream media companies in Australia, whereby there was a transfer of money from the Googles and the Facebook, the social media platforms, to media companies, which was completely non-transparent. Nobody knows who got what or what the conditions of the transfer of the funds were. So in principle, it's a good idea, but there has to be transparency. And actually, even with this damages case, I still don't think Rupert Murdoch needs more money, right? But that was the deal that was done. And it's actually, that has the potential, with a lack of transparency, if it's ongoing, to lead to very kind of dark and invisible outcomes. So, but it would have been good if it had seeded a lot of local media coverage, but I don't think it's done that. And notwithstanding that deal, the major media companies are still sacking journalists. So, it's not a panacea, just getting Google and Facebook to give media moguls bags of money.
Do you mind one last quick question?
Sure.
Gentleman in the blue jacket.
Yeah.
First, thank you for being here. It's quite the honor. My name's Kyle Matus. I'm a UVA graduate, new to town, Charlottesville resident, and previously a Capitol Hill staffer. In 2014 and 2015, I was the policy director for the House Rules Committee, where we shared jurisdiction on Trade Promotion Authority, and we'd hoped to share jurisdiction on TPP. Part of my job was to help write TPA and to whip Republicans to vote for TPA. That succeeded, thanks in part to President Obama delivering a few dozen Democrats on TPA in the House. But ultimately, TPP we withdrew, and my efforts failed. So I'm asking you, I guess, for a grade. Why did we fail? And what was the view, or what was the damage done to American leadership globally?
Well, look, okay, so what happened was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which for those of you that aren't familiar, was actually an Obama initiative. And in fact, Obama's defense secretary said he thought it was more important to American security, or the security of the Asia Pacific, than having an extra aircraft carrier task force. So this wasn't just about trade, this was about strategy and national security. And there were 12 countries, you know, US, Canada, Mexico, Chile, Peru, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Singapore, and there are others, but it was a big deal. Trump campaigned on pulling out of the TPP, and we all thought, we were hoping that we could talk him out of pulling out of it, if you like. But he was determined to do so. And to be honest, as you know, the politics of free trade are never easy. From Australia's point of view, we have very, very low trade barriers. So we will sign up more or less to any free trade deal going, because to be honest, there's not much we can give you. You know, it's pretty easy to do business in Australia. We don't have big tariffs, so we're always in favour. So free trade actually has very broad political support in Australia, by and large. It does have a few detractors. But, you know, protectionism is much more of a thing in the US. And I mean, you know, there have been big consequences with globalisation to many parts of the United States. So when Trump pulled out, most people thought the deal was as dead as a dodo. I mean, literally just about everyone did. And John Key, the New Zealand Prime Minister then, and I decided in Lima, the end of 2016, that we should see if we could keep it going. And people were saying, you are flogging a dead horse. I got politically criticised for it. And John and I used to joke that it just proved, because we were animal lovers, we would keep doing it, because if the horse was dead, it wouldn't mind the flogging. and so we kept at it, and we kept it alive, because we got Shinzo Abe over the line, then PM of Japan, sadly recently assassinated. And so the TPP, now called the CPTPP, Justin Trudeau insisted on those two additional adjectives of comprehensive and progressive, which I've no idea what they mean. apparently when the Canadian negotiators proposed it, everyone just went, oh yeah, whatevs. Sure, Canadian Pacific, I don't know what it means. Anyway, it's the same deal, minus the US. The UK is going to join it, Taiwan has applied, People's Republic of China have applied. A few challenges there, I can tell you, from our point of view. I mean, given what they've done to us, some trade coercion. But the fact is we kept it alive, and that has given your country a free option. So the bottom line is, if we had not kept it alive, it would just be a bunch of mouldering documents in lawyers' offices. The fact that it's still going, it does mean that a future American administration could re-enter it. So it was actually I remember Shinzo at the time was worried that if we kept going with it, we would offend Trump. And, you know, our argument was twofold. We said, one, out of the room, out of the deal. So,
which he would understand that.
I don't think Trump ever had any problems with that. And the second one, I remember giving a speech in Washington about this. I said, look, the fact that the deal's alive gives you an option. So you don't have, you're out, you don't have to come back, you may be out forever, but the fact that that trade deal is alive means you can always come back in if you choose. So don't give up hope. Your work was, the answer to your grade is, I would say 4 out of 5, because 4 out of 5 because you didn't get America in, but the great work that you did on it made it an outstanding, the most ambitious and advanced trade deal in the world, and that enabled the other 11 countries to conclude it. So you shouldn't regard your work as having been wasted.
Well, on that note, Madam Lord Mayor, Mr. Prime Minister, thank you so much for your generosity of time and spirit and candor. It's been a fascinating afternoon hearing your insights. We've learned a lot from you. I invite my UVA colleagues to thank the Prime Minister and Lord Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you.